Charles was peeling shrimp for Emily right in front of me.
Thank you, Charles.
Everyone else at the table was silently observing my reaction.
I'm sorry, sister. Please don't be upset. Charles has always been this gentlemanly.
Really? But Charles had never peeled shrimp for me. Whenever I asked him, he would just frown and refuse without hesitation.
Grace, Emily can't peel shrimp. Don't be unreasonable.
Emily, out of Charles's sight, curled her lips at me, as if proudly declaring her territory.
Well, since you're such a gentleman, I guess I'll be a bit more considerate.
As soon as I finished speaking, I turned and moved closer to his friend, James, under everyone's watchful eyes.
How careless, you got something on your mouth.
Charles's face instantly turned cold. James was initially taken aback, but when he realized what was happening, his face flushed red.
Thank you.
Charles watched the whole scene with a dark expression. He even stopped peeling the shrimp.
Grace!
What's wrong? Am I not being considerate enough?
His fists clenched tightly, and his gaze grew colder.
Grace, if you keep being unreasonable, we will break up.
The same old trick. I had chased him for 3 years, always at his beck and call.
Fine.
At my words, a complex emotion rose in his eyes: anger, deep resentment, and disbelief.
Please don't argue. It's all my fault. Don't break up because of me, okay?
Her eyes were red and pitiful. Charles couldn't stand seeing her cry and quickly bent down to wipe her tears, comforting her gently as if she were fragile. Meeting Charles's gaze filled with blame and disappointment, I lowered my eyes. 3 years. This was the first time I had seen him so tenderly and carefully comforting someone. And that person wasn't me. My heart tightened instinctively, but it wasn't as painful as I had imagined. I realized that all my joy and grievances should come to an end. I stood up to leave, pausing at the door with a last glimmer of hope. But unfortunately, Charles was bending down to hold Emily in his arms, softly comforting her, completely indifferent to my departure. My heart sank, and the last bit of hope was ruthlessly shattered. I turned and left. I realized that all my joy and grievances should come to an end. I stood up to leave, pausing at the door with a last glimmer of hope. But unfortunately, Charles was bending down to hold Emily in his arms, softly comforting her, completely indifferent to my departure. My heart sank, and the last bit of hope was ruthlessly shattered. I turned and left. I picked out a short dress that accentuated my figure. I have a great figure, with curves in all the right places. Charles used to dislike me wearing such clothes, telling me not to wear them. Back then, I thought it was because of his possessiveness, a sign of his love for me. I secretly felt pleased and softly agreed to his request. But now, it seems it was just because Emily never wore such clothes. Although Emily and I look somewhat alike, her appearance and demeanor are more demure, while I am quite the opposite. I tossed my long, wavy hair with a touch of flirtatious charm. Looking at myself in the mirror, I felt a sense of relief. At University. By the time I arrived, the basketball game was about to start. As soon as I entered, I caused quite a stir among the spectators. The sunlight cast a warm glow on my face, making my fair skin appear even more radiant.
Wow, that girl is so beautiful.
Seriously, her figure is amazing. I'm so envious.
I didn't expect to see Charles there as well. One of his friends nudged him with an elbow and nodded in my direction.
Wow, Charles, is that your girlfriend? I'm so jealous, she's gorgeous.
He didn't deny it. He walked over to me in a few strides.
Why did you leave without a word that day? Emily felt guilty for so long because of it.
I looked up and nonchalantly replied.
Oh.
He paused. His gaze fell on my clothes, and he frowned.
I told you, that kind of outfit doesn't suit you.
I rolled my eyes at him. Then I turned my attention to James. James noticed my gaze and turned his head. Our eyes met. The moment he saw me, his eyes lit up, and a smile spread across his face. It was warm, like a little sun, making it hard to look away. Smiles are contagious, I guess. Seeing him, I couldn't help but smile too. Charles sensed something was off and followed my gaze. He immediately spotted James. His expression turned incredibly sour.
Are you here to see James?
You're funny. If not for James, who else would I be here for? You?
He didn't say anything. The game began. It was obvious to everyone that Charles was always deliberately targeting James. But James remained unfazed, handling everything with ease. He darted past a defender like lightning, raised the ball high with both hands, leaped up, and shot the ball perfectly into the hoop. James's team quickly took the lead. As the whistle blew, the game finally ended. The champions were undoubtedly James and his team. I excitedly walked past Charles and handed a bottle of water to James.
How was it? Was I amazing?
His eyes sparkled, like a little puppy eagerly waiting for praise. I couldn't help but reach out and pat his head. Amazing. Super amazing.
Thank you.
Amidst the noise, I saw James's Adam's apple bob, and the redness at the tips of his ears gradually spread to the roots. I smiled and blurted out. You're so cute. James was the most easily blushing person I had ever met.
Then, I like you. Can I pursue you?
His straightforwardness caught me off guard. The breath by my ear grew hotter, filled with anticipation and undeniable affection. Although I knew James was Charles's brother, we weren't very close. However, I noticed that every time I ran into James, he seemed a bit uneasy.
I don't understand why James suddenly developed feelings for me, but the affection in his eyes seemed genuine.
Charles stood nearby and spoke out of turn.
Grace, haven't you had enough?
Charles glared at me holding James's hand, barely containing his anger.
How long do you plan to keep up this farce?
I turned around and saw Charles, surrounded by an aura of coldness, with Emily standing behind him, looking smug.
Come here. I can forgive you. If you want me to spend more time with you, I can. Just stop this.
There was a hint of command in his last word. Emily stood behind him, one hand on her hip, eyes filled with disdain, like a first wife looking at a soon-to-be second wife. I glanced at Charles. His expression was very calm, not the least bit anxious.
Charles, haven't I made myself clear? We have broken up, and I don't like you anymore. You can finally be with the one you love openly. Aren't you happy?
I held James's hand. He surprisingly didn't refute. Charles scrutinized me for a while, trying to find a hint of deceit on my face. But there was none. After speaking, I instinctively held James's hand and walked away with large strides. Suddenly, I heard James speak. I turned my head slightly to look at him.
Excuse me.
As expected, his ears were as red as if they were about to bleed. He pointed to the hand I was holding. I quickly let go.
Can I pursue you?
The moment he finished speaking, I focused all my attention on him. Seeing me staring at him, he became a bit flustered.
Why are you staring at me? Is there something on my face?
James's face turned crimson. He anxiously raised his hand to wipe his face.
Yes.
He was stunned for a moment, then almost jumped up in joy, as happy as a child. From that day on, James brought me breakfast and snacks every day. His friends couldn't stand it and scolded him.
Seriously, man, that's not how you pursue a girl. Others send flowers every day, and you haven't even given her a single petal.
Which girl doesn't like flowers? How are you going to win her over like this?
It was as if he had discovered a new world. From then on, I received several bouquets of flowers every day. My roommates were shocked by the pile of flowers in our dorm.
Is he running a flower shop? How can he send so many flowers every day?
At 11 p.m., James messaged me, asking if I was free the next day.
Are you free tomorrow?
After a moment's hesitation, I replied.
Yes, I'm free tomorrow.
He quickly responded.
Great! Get some sleep early. Don't stay up late. Good night!
I was taken aback. James messaged me every night, and when we weren't together during the day, my phone was always filled with his messages. Whenever I felt unwell, he was the first to arrive. Last time, I forgot to have breakfast, which led to a stomach cramp that left me pale and sweating. When he arrived, there was no smile on his face. It was the first time I saw him angry.
Why don't you take care of yourself? You were like this before, and you're still like this now.
From that moment on, he brought me breakfast every day, rain or shine, and made sure I finished it before leaving. My roommates teased that I would be a henpecked wife in the future. This made me think of my past self. I used to send Charles countless messages every day. And his replies were always just a single word. I remember once when I had a fever and felt really unwell. I called Charles.
Grace, I'm really busy right now. Stop bothering me.
Then he hung up without hesitation. Later, I found out from others that Charles's so-called busy day was spent picking up Emily from the airport. I realized that what truly broke my heart wasn't him peeling shrimp for Emily in front of me at the party. That was just the last straw. It's quite laughable. I pursued Charles for 3 whole years. And we broke up just 6 months after getting together. That day, he was drunk and suddenly appeared in front of me. He grabbed my wrist and, in his drunken state, pulled me into his arms. His breath, smelling of alcohol, tickled my neck. He murmured softly, almost dreamily. But I heard it clearly.
Emily.
I suppressed my sadness and reminded him that I was Grace, not Emily. He stared at my face for a long time, dazed.
Let's be together.
He didn't say he liked me, nor did he make any promises. It wasn't a confession, it felt more like a command. At that time, despite my doubts, I was overwhelmed with joy and didn't care about anything else. Looking back now, it all makes sense. I received a text message from an unknown number.
Grace, I don't agree with the breakup. This isn't something you can decide alone. Stop being difficult. Emily returned alone and is an orphan. She needs me. Be understanding, okay?
I felt physically uncomfortable after reading it. I couldn't believe I had liked someone like this for so many years. Indeed, being blinded by love is dangerous, otherwise, you'll end up digging your own grave. Despite having 1,000 words in my heart, they all condensed into 2.
Idiot.
After sending it, there was a moment of silence on the other end. Then came the reply.
You weren't like this before.
I rolled my eyes and decisively blocked the number. Early in the morning, I saw James standing downstairs, holding breakfast, looking like a statue. He stood there silently, quietly. It seemed he had been there for quite a while. I hurried down. When James saw me, a smile spread across his face, lighting up his features.
Good morning. I brought breakfast for you.
Thank you, James. Why didn't you call me to come down?
I was afraid you were still asleep and didn't want to wake you.
I couldn't help but laugh. The sunlight filtered through the thin clouds, casting a silver glow on the boy's face, making my eyes squint.
Do you have any plans today?
No, what about you?
My phone buzzed with a message. I opened it to see it was from my roommate, Sophia.
Are you silly? He's asking if you have plans today because he wants to ask you out. Date. Do you understand a date?
I immediately pictured Sophia's exasperated face as she scolded me. I looked up at the building in confusion. What I saw shocked me. Including Sophia, all 3 of my roommates were crowded at the window, gossiping and watching us. As I wondered how they could hear our conversation, I suddenly noticed a few of James's friends standing not far away, looking equally nosy.
James, let's go on a date today.
Okay.
I realized that all my joy and grievances should come to an end.
I stood up to leave, pausing at the door with a last glimmer of hope.
But unfortunately, Charles was bending down to hold Emily in his arms, softly comforting her, completely indifferent to my departure.
My heart sank, and the last bit of hope was ruthlessly shattered. I turned and left.
I had worked tirelessly, only to see someone else reap the benefits. Even if I no longer cared, it still felt uncomfortable.
I quietly averted my gaze. I paid no further attention to the 2 of them.
We have a promotion today. Couples who kiss can receive a small gift for free.
Upon hearing this, Emily clung to Charles, blushing and sweetly calling him Charlie.
I want that little gift.
Charles frowned and shook his head. When he looked up and saw my amused expression, he clenched his fists. Suddenly, he leaned down and kissed Emily on the lips. Afterward, he looked up to gauge my reaction.
Ugh. That's gross.
Charles's face turned extremely sour. It was clear we couldn't continue eating there. I linked arms with James and left the restaurant. Just as we stepped out, we heard the sound of dishes smashing in anger. I turned slightly and saw Charles punching the wall with a clenched fist. After finishing our meal at another restaurant, we ran into Charles and Emily again in the parking garage.
What a small world, running into them so many times in one day.
I sighed and was about to get into the car when Emily suddenly rushed up to block my way.
Grace, do you think this keychain is pretty?
I caught a glimpse of a smug look in her eyes.
It's ugly, just like you.
James couldn't help but chuckle. She hadn't expected me to be so blunt and stood there, stunned. Honestly, that keychain was really ugly. The kind of ugly you can't bear to look at. Emily's eyes started to redden again as she processed my words. Though Charles was still trying to comfort her, his face showed clear signs of impatience. Just as I was about to turn and leave with James, Charles suddenly grabbed my hand, his grip so tight it made me wince. In an instant, James punched Charles in the face. Charles hadn't expected him to actually throw a punch in public and took the hit squarely. But he quickly recovered and fought back. It didn't take long for both of them to end up with visible injuries.
Stop it, both of you!
I stepped in front of James, pushing Charles away with all my strength. He seemed shocked that I would push him, stumbling back with a look of disbelief and anger.
You're pushing me for him?
Why can't I push you for James? You can protect Emily, so why can't I protect James? Charles, I know you like Emily, so I let you be together. But why can't you let me go? I'm not shameless. I can't spend my life trailing behind you like a fool.
Hearing this, Charles wavered, his eyes filled with complex emotions. He reached out to grab me again. I dodged and pulled James away. I realized that all my joy and grievances should come to an end. I stood up to leave, pausing at the door with a last glimmer of hope. But unfortunately, Charles was bending down to hold Emily in his arms, softly comforting her, completely indifferent to my departure. My heart sank, and the last bit of hope was ruthlessly shattered. I turned and left. That day, James mysteriously took me out. When I asked where we were going, he just smiled and said nothing. When we arrived at our destination, I recognized it immediately. It was the orphanage where I had spent part of my childhood.
Do you remember this place?
Of course I did, but I didn't understand why he brought me here or how he knew about it.
Do you remember the chubby little boy who used to follow you around here?
Suddenly, I remembered. When I first arrived, there was a chubby boy who was always bullied by the other kids. They would steal his things and throw his clothes into the water. With a sense of justice even as a child, I couldn't stand it and always helped him chase away the bullies. I even made him call me boss and promised to protect him. I still remember the way his eyes sparkled with hope back then. But after a few years, he was taken away by someone, and a few months later, I was adopted too. The shadow of the person from my past overlapped with James. Their eyes were so similar. I was a bit shocked. No wonder I felt a sense of familiarity when I saw James. If he hadn't mentioned it, it would have been hard to connect the chubby, somewhat cute little boy with the tall man standing before me. James led me to a wall, where the yellowed surface bore some childish carvings, instantly bringing back many old memories.
Look at this! Do you remember?
It read, "One day, I will take my little brother and explore the world." That was clearly my writing. Below it, "One day, I will follow my boss and explore the world." I chuckled. That must have been written by James. Suddenly, James hugged me from behind, burying his face in the crook of my neck.
It's not a sudden affection, it's always been there.
I realized he was answering the question I had asked earlier. After dropping James off at school, Emily sent me a message. The last line was an invitation to meet at a cafe the next day. It wasn't hard to guess what she wanted. As soon as I entered the cafe, I spotted Emily. The fragile demeanor she had in front of Charles was gone, replaced by an air of arrogance, making her seem like a different person.
You recognize this bracelet, don't you? Looks familiar, right?
I just mentioned it to Charles, and the next day he gave it to me.
You really like picking up things others don't want.
I replied with a smile, leaning back on the sofa. Her arrogant face twisted in front of me. Emily's hands shook with anger as she stood up and threw her coffee in my face.
Grace, why don't you just disappear? You've broken up, yet you keep trying to seduce Charles. Let me tell you, Charles only loves me.
Emily glared at me fiercely. I wiped the coffee off my face, stood up swiftly, grabbed Emily's hair, and slammed her head onto the table, giving her a hard slap. Emily's face swelled up instantly.
I'm going to end you.
Emily screamed like a banshee, struggling to break free from my grip. Smack. I slapped her again, making it symmetrical. Emily's screams grew louder, attracting the attention of the staff. Seeing this, I poured another cup of coffee on her face, grabbed her hair, and threw her to the ground. While Emily was still on the floor, I left the scene. Back home, Emily bombarded me with messages, filled with insults and taunts, each one more vulgar than the last. I raised an eyebrow. This was a far cry from the delicate and kind image she presented to Charles. I wondered how Charles would react if he saw his supposedly gentle and kind muse in this state. Since Charles found out I was with James, he had been texting me from different numbers and standing outside my dorm. Being harassed by these two every day was truly exhausting. After some thought, I requested the surveillance footage from the cafe and sent it, along with Emily's abusive messages, to Charles. I also sent Emily the records of Charles's daily harassment, with a note, "Keep your troll in check. I'm not interested." After that, Charles's harassment lessened, and Emily rarely sent me abusive messages. As expected, the two had fallen out. They were either arguing or on their way to an argument, leaving them with little energy to bother me. Without their harassment, I felt much better. My days were filled with teasing James, and I never got tired of it. I realized that all my joy and grievances should come to an end.
I stood up to leave, pausing at the door with a last glimmer of hope.
Unfortunately, Charles was bending down to hold Emily in his arms, softly comforting her, completely indifferent to my departure.
My heart sank, and the last bit of hope was ruthlessly shattered. I turned and left.
The last time I thought of them was at a class reunion a few years later, overhearing some gossip.
Did you hear about Emily and Charles?
Yeah, after they had a complete falling out, Emily latched onto another wealthy man.
I heard his wife publicly confronted Emily, even cut off her hair.
Oh, that's harsh. But didn't the wealthy man divorce his wife for Emily?
Yes, but their marriage is far from happy. He cheated on her shortly after they got married.
And what about Charles?
His family went bankrupt, he dropped out of school, became a heavy drinker, and ended up unemployed. It's uncertain if he even has enough to eat now.
I merely raised an eyebrow after hearing all this, feeling indifferent.
Your husband is here to pick you up. It's one thing to leave early for fun, but even for a class reunion?
Sophia patted my shoulder and nodded towards the door with a smile.
What can I say? I'm under strict supervision.
It was snowing outside. As soon as I reached the door, James came over and draped another coat over me, playfully tapping my cold, reddened nose.
Let's go home.